From Bobby Driscoll, Disney's biggest child star, who was found dead and buried as an unidentified man, to Laura Lee Mitchell, who seemed to disappear from the public record altogether, to Lee Ocker, America's beloved television hero, whose life ended in heartbreaking poverty. In this video, we're taking a look at what really happened to some of the biggest child stars of the 1950s, who vanished from the public eye. Let's begin with Bobby Driscoll. Before there was any such thing as a modern Disney kid, before the theme parks and the merchandise and the television empire, there was a little boy named Bobby Driscoll. He was the first child that Walt Disney ever put under a long-term contract, and for a few golden years, he was the most famous boy in America. Bobby was born in the year 1937 in Iowa. His family moved out to California when he was small, partly because a doctor thought the desert air would help the boy breathe easier. In Hollywood, a barber of all people suggested that the cute, bright kid should try out for the movies. That small suggestion changed everything. By the age of 6, Bobby was already working in films. By the age of 9, he was signed to Walt Disney himself. What made Bobby special was not just that he was cute, although he certainly was. It was that he could actually act. He was natural in front of the camera, in a way that most adults never manage. He appeared in the Disney film Song of the South. He played the lead boy in So Dear to My Heart. Then, in the year 1949, he starred in a small tense thriller called The Window, where he played a boy who witnesses a murder and cannot get any grown-up to believe him. He was so good in that film that the Academy gave him a special juvenile Oscar. He was one of the youngest people ever honored that way. Then came his two biggest roles. In the year 1950, he played Jim Hawkins in Disney's Treasure Island, running around a real ship in a real adventure. And when Disney made the animated film Peter Pan, they used Bobby as the voice of Peter, and the animators even studied his movements and his face to draw the boy who would never grow up. There is a strange, sad joke hidden in that. The world remembers Bobby Driscoll's face as the boy who never grew older. But Bobby Driscoll, the real living child, was about to grow up in the cruelest way a Hollywood kid could. Because here is the thing that nobody told these children. The studio loved them while they were small and adorable. The studio did not have much use for them once they became teenagers. When Bobby hit puberty, his skin broke out badly with acne. His face changed, the way every face changes. And Disney, quietly and without much kindness, let him go. He was 13 years old, and the biggest career of his life was already behind him. Bobby tried to keep acting. He enrolled in a regular public high school, hoping for a normal life. But the other kids treated him strangely because he was famous, and he later said he felt like an outsider everywhere he went. The film roles dried up, the phone stopped ringing, and a lonely, confused teenager who had once been adored by millions started looking for a way to feel something again. He found drugs. By the time he was 17, he was using narcotics, and the addiction would follow him for the rest of his short life. The arrests came next: drug possession, assault. He drifted. He got married and had children and could not hold the family together. He spent time in prison. When he got out, the movie town that had made him a star wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. He drifted all the way across the country to New York City, and for a little while, he floated around the edges of Andy Warhol's art crowd, another lost beautiful face among many. And then, in the spring of the year 1968, two boys who were playing in an abandoned building in the East Village found a body. It was a young man, lying on a cot among the trash and broken glass. There was no identification on him at all. The police could not figure out who he was. He was photographed, and then he was buried in a pauper's grave on Hart Island, the place where New York City buries the people that nobody claimed. He lay there nameless for over a year. It was only later, when his mother was trying to find him so that he could see his dying father one last time, that the truth came out. The fingerprints were matched. The nameless young man in the pauper's grave was Bobby Driscoll. He had died at just 31 years old, alone and unknown, in a ruined building far from Hollywood. The boy who never grew up had grown up after all, and the world had looked away while it happened. Laura Lee Mitchell. Some of the children on this list disappeared slowly, fading a little more each year, until nobody noticed they were gone. Laura Lee Mitchell is different. She was here, and then she was simply not. And the trail behind her goes cold in a way that still unsettles the people who go looking for it. In the late 1940s and the very start of the 1950s, Laura Lee was a working child actress with a real career in front of her. She was a pretty, poised little girl who appeared in a handful of films during those years. On paper, she had everything everything a studio looked for. She had the face, she had the manners, she had the timing. Producers were putting her in pictures, and there was every reason to believe she would keep climbing the way other child actresses of her time did. But Laura Lee's childhood was shadowed by something that had nothing to do with her talent. It was a bitter, ugly fight over who actually got to raise her. Her early life was tangled up in a custody battle that spilled out of the family home and into the courtrooms, and worst of all, into the newspapers. The Los Angeles papers followed the story because it had everything that sold copies. There was a famous little girl. There were adults pointing fingers at each other. There were claims and counterclaims about who loved her and who was using her and who deserved her. For a child, that kind of public tug of war is a special kind of damage. Imagine being small and famous at the same time. Your whole life is being argued over by grown-ups in front of strangers. Imagine reading, or being old enough to almost read, about yourself in the paper as a prize to be won rather than a person to be cared for. The court fights and the instability chewed up the years when her career should have been building. A child actress needs steady adults, steady schooling, and steady work. Laura Lee had chaos instead, and then the work stopped. The roles that should have carried her into her teenage years never came. This was already the danger point for every child star, the moment when the industry decided whether it still wanted you. For Laura Lee, weighed down by all that turmoil at home, the answer from Hollywood was no. She slipped out of the picture business while she was still young. What happened next is the part that turns her story from sad to genuinely mysterious. The public record on Laura Lee Mitchell grows thin and then almost vanishes. There are traces that suggest her adult life took a very hard turn, including trouble with the law and time spent locked away. But after a certain point, she seems to drop out of the documented world altogether. She does not turn up in the usual places where former actors are eventually found, whether that is a later career, a public appearance, an interview, or even a clear obituary that everyone agrees on. That is the strange thing about her. Most child stars who fade can still be tracked. Somebody eventually knocks on a door, finds a quiet neighbor who used to be famous, and writes the "Where Are They Now" story. With Laura Lee Mitchell, that story has never been fully written because the facts run out. The little girl who was fought over so loudly in the newspapers left the record almost silently. She is one of the truest disappearances on this entire list. A real child star who was there in the bright lights and then was gone, leaving researchers to guess at the shape of a life they cannot quite see. Scotty Beckett. There is a haunting coincidence buried in this list, and Scotty Beckett is one half of it. He died in the very same year as Bobby Driscoll, the year 1968. Both had been beloved child stars. Both had spiraled downward through drugs and trouble, and both left this world under circumstances that were murky and sad. Two of the brightest small faces of an earlier Hollywood, gone within months of each other, each one long forgotten by the industry that had built them up. Scotty was born in the year 1929, which made him a bit older than most of the other names here, but his fame stretched right into the 1950s, and his fall happened during that decade. He first became famous as one of the kids in the Our Gang comedies, the series that most people today know as The Little Rascals. He was the little boy in the oversized cap, the one who was often paired with Spanky and the rest of the gang. He was one of the most popular children in the whole series, adored for being small and funny and sweet. But Scotty was more than a comedy kid. He could really act, and he proved it as he grew. In the year 1946, he played the young Al Jolson in The Jolson Story, one of the biggest musical films of its day. That role showed everyone that Scotty was not just a cute face from the shorts. He had range, he had presence. He looked for a moment like a child actor who might actually beat the odds and become a real leading man. The odds won. As Scotty moved through his teenage years and into young adulthood, his life began coming apart in ways that the studios could not paper over. There were troubles at home and troubles with school. Then came the truly serious problems. Scotty developed dependencies on drugs and alcohol, and he started running into the law again and again. Through the 1950s, his name kept appearing in the papers, but no longer for his roles. It appeared for arrests. It appeared for fights and car crashes and legal messes. Each new headline chipped away at whatever chance He had left of being taken seriously as an actor. Hollywood is not a patient place, with people who become difficult, and Scotty had become very difficult. The offers slowed and then nearly stopped. The gifted little boy from the Little Rascals and the Jolson story turned into a cautionary tale that people in the business talked about and shook their heads over. He was still young, still capable, but the town had already written him off. His ending is one of the most disturbing on this list, precisely because so much about it stays unclear. In the year 1968, Scotty was staying at a rest home in the Hollywood area. He was found there badly beaten and in bad shape. Not long after he died, there was medication involved. There were questions about exactly what had happened to him and why, and those questions were never fully answered to everyone's satisfaction. Was it his own hand? Was it the result of the beating? Was it some mix of a hard life, finally collecting its debt? The record leaves room for all of it and settles none of it. What is certain is that Scotty Beckett died young, at just 38 years old, far from the warmth of the fame he had known as a child. The little boy in the crooked cap, who had made a whole country laugh, ended in confusion and pain that nobody has ever quite explained. He is remembered now mostly as a warning about what the machine can do to a child it no longer needs. Tommy Rettig. Not every story on this list ends in a graveyard. Some of these children clawed their way out of the wreckage of child fame and built real, solid lives in the ordinary world. Tommy Rettig is one of the best examples of that, and his second act is so surprising that it almost feels made up. He went from being one of the most famous boys on television to becoming a genuine expert in a field that did not even exist when he was a child star. Tommy was born in the year 1941. He started performing very young, first on the stage and then in films. He worked alongside big names early on, appearing in the colorful fantasy film The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T, and even sharing screen time with Marilyn Monroe in The Western River of No Return. But the role that made him a household face came on the small screen. In the year 1954, Tommy became the very first boy to star opposite the famous Collie in the television series Lassie. He played Jeff Miller, the farm boy and his loyal dog, and for 3 seasons, he was one of the most recognized children in the country. For millions of American families in the middle 1950s, Tommy Rettig was Lassie's boy. Every week, children watched him and his dog get into and out of trouble on the farm. He was wholesome and likable and completely familiar, but television child stars face the same brutal clock as movie child stars. Tommy grew. The show eventually moved on to a new boy and a new family, which was the pattern for that particular series. And Tommy Rettig, still young, found himself on the outside of the fame that had defined his childhood. The years right after a child star's fall are almost always the hardest, and Tommy did stumble. Like several others on this list, he had a period of drug involvement, and he faced a serious legal case connected to it. For a while, it looked like his story might follow the same dark path as so many of the others. Another gifted kid, brought low by the strange pressures of early fame and the empty space that comes after it. There was a real chance that Tommy Rettig would become just another sad headline, but he did not. And the reason he did not is one of the most unexpected turns you will hear. Tommy discovered computers. This was in the era when personal computers were brand new, and most people did not understand them at all. Tommy threw himself into learning how they worked, and it turned out he had a real gift for it. He became deeply skilled with early software, especially with the database programming languages that businesses were just beginning to depend on. He wrote about them. He taught other people how to use them. He became a respected consultant, the kind of person that companies actually called when they needed an expert. Think about how strange and wonderful that is. The little boy who ran across a television farm with a collie grew up to become a software pioneer, a man that professional programmers looked up to. He had found a whole new identity, one that had nothing to do with the camera and everything to do with his own mind. The fame of his childhood became just a small odd fact about a man who had built something entirely his own. Tommy Rettig died in the year 1996 of a heart attack at the age of 54. That is far too young, and there is real sadness in losing him. But his life is not a tragedy of the kind that swallowed Bobby Driscoll or Scotty Beckett. Tommy got out. He faced the fall, he passed through a hard stretch, and he came out the other side as a whole and respected man doing work he loved. Of all the children on this list, he is one of the ones you can feel good about. He disappeared from Hollywood, yes, but he did not disappear from life. He just found a better one. If you were making a scary movie or a strange science fiction picture in the late 1950s and you needed a clever, wide-eyed little boy, there was a very good chance you were going to call Charles Herbert. For a few busy years, he was one of the most in-demand child actors in the whole business, turning up in film after film. And then, almost as quickly as he had arrived, he was gone. And the story of what came later is a long and painful one. Charles was born in the year 1948, and he started working while he was still very small. He was a natural on camera, and directors loved him because he could hit his marks and deliver his lines without the fuss that many child actors brought to a set. He piled up credits at a remarkable pace. By the time he was still just a boy, he had appeared in something like 40 films and television shows, which is an enormous body of work for someone so young. His most famous role came in the classic horror film The Fly, released in the year 1958. In it, he played the young son of the scientist whose experiment goes so horribly wrong. He also appeared in other creepy and memorable pictures of the era, including the ghost story 13 Ghosts and the monster film The Colossus of New York. He was not only a horror kid either. He shared the screen with major stars in bigger productions, including the Cary Grant and Sophia Loren comedy Houseboat. For a stretch in the late 1950s, Charles Herbert was simply everywhere. But the same wall that stopped so many of these children stopped him too. As he grew older and moved toward his teenage years, the flood of roles slowed to a trickle and then dried up almost completely. The industry that had kept him working non-stop suddenly had far less use for him. This is the cruelest pattern in all of these stories. The busier a child star was, the harder the silence hit when it came, because they had known nothing but constant work and constant attention. To go from 40 jobs to none is a shock that a young person is rarely prepared to handle. Charles struggled in the years that followed. The transition out of child stardom was rough, and life dealt him real hardship. He faced personal losses and battled addiction over the long stretch of his adult life. He fell into obscurity and at times into genuine poverty. The bright, busy boy from all those films spent long years far outside the spotlight, wrestling with troubles that had nothing to do with the talent he had shown as a child. There is a small note of grace near the end of his story, though. In his later years, as classic film fans rediscovered the old horror and science fiction movies of the 1950s, some of them rediscovered Charles Herbert too. Fans of those pictures reached out to him. He appeared at gatherings and conventions where people who loved the old films could meet him and tell him that his work had meant something to them. After so many years of being forgotten, he got to feel, at least a little, that he was remembered and appreciated. For a man who had disappeared so completely, that late warmth mattered. Charles Herbert died in the year 2015. He had lived a long and difficult life, one that started at the very top of the child acting world and then descended into decades of struggle. He is remembered by the people who love those old films as one of the finest child actors of his time, a boy who could do anything a director asked, whose face lit up dozens of movies before the industry quietly closed its door on him. His story is a reminder that fame in childhood guarantees nothing about the life that follows, and that a person can be everywhere one year and nowhere the next. Some child actors are hired for being cute. Rex Thompson was hired for something rarer. He had a kind of grave, intelligent quality on screen, a seriousness that made him perfect for playing young princes and thoughtful boys in big historical pictures. In the middle 1950s, that quality put him in some of the most lavish films of the day. And then, when his childhood ended, he stepped away so completely that following his later trail is genuinely difficult. Rex was born in the early 1940s, and he came up through the business as one of those polished, well-spoken child performers who seemed older than their years. In the year 1953, he appeared in the historical drama Young Bess, a rich costume picture set in the world of English royalty. He was well suited to that kind of material. There was nothing goofy or clownish about him. He carried himself like a small adult, which is exactly what those stately productions needed from their child roles. His most widely seen work came in the year 1956, when he appeared in the beloved musical The King and I. In that film, he played Louis, the young son of the English schoolteacher, who travels to a faraway royal court. Standing among all that music and spectacle, Rex held his own. Millions of people saw that film over the years, and they saw Rex Thompson in it, even if most of them never knew his name. He also took on other dramatic roles in the period, including heavier material that asked a lot of a young actor, and he handled it with the same careful poise. For a while, it looked like Rex might be one of the children who kept climbing. He had the talent for it, and he had the particular kind of presence that could have grown into adult character work. But something about the transition did not take. As he moved past childhood and into his teenage years, the roles that had once come his way grew scarcer. The specific magic of a serious, princely little boy does not translate automatically into a busy adult career. The very quality that made him special as a child may have made him harder to place as a young man. And so Rex Thompson did what a surprising number of these children did. He walked away. The details of exactly why and exactly how are not richly documented, which is itself part of his story. He did not become a tabloid figure. He did not spiral into public trouble. He simply stopped appearing, and the record of his adult life grows quiet and hard to trace. There are indications that he moved on to an entirely different kind of life, away from performing, the way many former child actors chose to do. Once the industry's interest cooled, that quietness is exactly why Rex Thompson belongs on a list like this. He was not a scandal. He was not a tragedy in the way that some of these others were. He was a genuinely gifted child who appeared in major films that people still watch today. And then he became one of the hardest of all these figures to actually locate in adulthood. He disappeared not with a crash, but with a kind of gentle vanishing, stepping out of the frame and pulling the door shut behind him. When you watch The King and I now, and see that serious boy among the singing and the silk, you are looking at someone who was there for a moment in the brightest part of Hollywood, and then chose to become almost impossible to find. Bobby Buntrock's story is short, and that is the whole sadness of it. He was a child of this era, a familiar young face in millions of living rooms, and he was gone before he ever really got the chance to grow into a man. His life reads like a small candle that burned for a little while, and then was blown out far too soon. Bobby was born in the year 1952, which places him among the youngest children connected to this period. He became known to television audiences as Harold, the little boy in the household, on the popular comedy series Hazel. The show revolved around a warm, bossy, good-hearted housekeeper who ran the family she worked for, and Bobby played the family's young son. Week after week, viewers watched him grow up a little on their screens, the way audiences do with child actors on long-running shows. He was a natural part of that television family, familiar and comfortable, the kind of face you stop noticing, precisely because it feels like it has always been there. When the series came to an end, Bobby was still just a boy. Like almost every other child on this list, he faced the hard truth that a popular television show does not owe you a career once it stops filming. The roles that a former child actor hopes for do not always arrive. Bobby's time in front of the camera wound down as his childhood did, and he moved toward an ordinary life away from the studios, the same quiet path that so many of these children ended up walking. But Bobby never got to see what that ordinary life would become. In the year 1974, when he was only 22 years old, he was killed in a car accident. It happened on a bridge, in a crash that ended everything in an instant. He was barely more than a boy still, a young man just starting to figure out who he would be. And then he was gone. There was no long struggle, no slow fade into obscurity over decades, no late chapter of any kind. There was only a bright childhood on television, and then a sudden, brutal ending. That is what makes Bobby Buntrock's story hit so hard despite how little there is to tell. Many of the people on this list disappeared slowly, and we can follow them into old age even when the trail is faint. Bobby disappeared all at once and permanently, at an age when most people are only beginning to build their lives. The familiar boy from the family comedy became one of the forgotten names of his generation, remembered mainly by the people who still watch those old episodes and notice the young face in the background of that fictional home. It is worth pausing on him for a moment because he deserves that much. Bobby Buntrack was a real child who brought a small, steady warmth to a show that a lot of people loved. He was not a scandal or a tragedy of his own making. He was simply a young man whose life was cut off before it could unfold. Among all the disappearances on this list, his is one of the most final and one of the most quietly heartbreaking, precisely because there was so much life he never got to live. Lauren Chapin for 6 years in the 1950s. Lauren Chapin was part of what looked like the perfect American family. Every week, she played the youngest daughter on one of the most wholesome and beloved shows on television. Audiences saw a cozy home, loving parents, and a sweet little girl growing up safe and cherished. What those audiences did not see, and could not have imagined, was that the real childhood behind that image was nothing like the one on the screen. Lauren Chapin's true story is one of the darkest on this list, and also, remarkably, one of the ones with the most hope in it. Lauren was born in the year 1945. She became famous as Kathy, the little girl nicknamed Kitten, on the series Father Knows Best. The show ran through the second half of the 1950s and into the very start of the 1960s, and it became a symbol of the ideal family life that America liked to believe in during those years. Lauren was the baby of that fictional family, adored by viewers, a picture of childhood innocence. On camera, everything about her world looked warm and secure. Off camera, it was the opposite. Lauren's real home life was troubled in deep and terrible ways. She later spoke openly about suffering abuse as a child, and about a family that was broken in places the public never saw. So here was a little girl going to work each week to play the safest, happiest child in America, and then going home to something entirely different. That gap between the pretend family and the real one is almost too painful to think about. The show that made her famous was selling a dream of family life that she herself did not have. When Father Knows Best ended, the protective structure of the show, however false its image, was gone, and Lauren's life came apart. Her teenage years and young adulthood were consumed by hardship. She fell into drug addiction. She went through a marriage that failed. She reached moments of such despair that she attempted to take her own life. She spent time in prison. The sweet little girl that America had watched grow up on television had, in reality, descended into a nightmare that few of her fans ever learned about at the time. If her story had ended there, it would have been one of the saddest on this entire list. A life crushed under the weight of a childhood that was a lie in both directions. But her story did not end there, and that is why she matters so much. At her lowest point, Lauren Chapin found faith. She became a devoted Christian, and that faith became the foundation on which she slowly rebuilt her life. She got clean, she found purpose. She began to speak publicly about everything she had survived, using her own hard story to reach other people who were struggling with abuse and addiction and despair. She wrote about her life. She turned the darkness she had lived through into something that might help someone else find a way out. Lauren Chapin never returned to being a big acting star. In that sense, she is a genuine disappearance from Hollywood. The little girl from the famous family show did not grow into an adult television career, but unlike so many of the others, she disappeared from the industry and then reappeared as something arguably more important, a survivor who used her voice to help others. Her later life became about recovery and meaning rather than fame. Her story carries a lesson that runs through this whole list. The perfect childhoods that Hollywood put on the screen in the 1950s were very often just that. Performances. Behind some of those glowing television families were real children carrying burdens that no one could see. Lauren Chapin lived that truth as painfully as anyone. That she came through it and then turned back to help others through the same darkness is one of the few genuinely uplifting turns in a list full of sad endings. Sherry Jackson is one of the more interesting cases on this list because she did not vanish because Hollywood rejected her. If anything, Hollywood wanted her to stay. She grew from a beloved child star into a striking adult performer, worked steadily for years, and then, more or less on her own terms, stepped back from the whole thing. Her disappearance was less a fall than a decision, and that makes her stand out from many of the others here. Sherry was born in the year 1942. She became a familiar face to television audiences in the 1950s as Terry, the daughter on the popular comedy known to viewers as The Danny Thomas Show or Make Room for Daddy. She was a pretty, poised child performer, exactly the kind of young talent that a family sitcom relied on. For several seasons, she was part of that television household, growing up in front of the audience the way so many of these children did. She was good at the work and audiences liked her, and she seemed set for a long run. What separates Sherry from most of the children on this list is that she actually made the dangerous leap from child star to working adult actress. That transition is the graveyard of countless young careers, the exact point where the majority of these stories turned sad. Sherry cleared it. As she grew up, she developed into a glamorous and capable performer, and the industry kept casting her. She moved into adult roles across film and television through the 1960s. She appeared in a wide range of productions and became known as a genuinely attractive and talented young actress, not just a former kid from a sitcom. One of her most remembered adult appearances came on a science fiction series where she played a memorable role that fans of that show still talk about today. She had a real screen presence as a grown woman, a magnetism that went well beyond the cute child she had once been. For a stretch, she looked like exactly the kind of former child star who beats the odds and simply keeps working forever, sliding from one role into the next without ever really leaving. And yet over time, Sherry Jackson stepped away. Her public profile grew quieter, the steady stream of roles slowed, and she gradually retreated from the spotlight that she had lived in since she was a small child. Unlike the tragic figures on this list, there is no story of ruin behind her exit. It reads much more like a person who had simply been famous her entire life, from earliest childhood into full adulthood, and who at some point decided she had done enough of it. She pulled back into a more private existence, out of the constant view of the public. That is a kind of disappearance too, and in some ways a healthier one. Sherry Jackson did not need Hollywood to be over. She seems to have chosen a quieter life over continued fame, which is its own quiet act of freedom for someone who never really got to choose privacy as a child. She had been a working performer since she was tiny, watched by strangers her whole life, and eventually, she claimed the ordinary quiet that most people take for granted. So when we count Sherry Jackson among the disappeared, we should do it with a different tone than we use for the tragedies. She was there in the bright lights for a very long time, first as a sweet sitcom daughter, and then as a glamorous adult star. And then she gently closed that chapter and walked into a private life of her own choosing. Of all the ways to disappear from Hollywood, that is one of the better ones. Patty McCormack. Some child actors are remembered for being adorable. Patty McCormack is remembered for being terrifying. As a little girl, she gave one of the most chilling child performances in the history of American film, playing a sweet-faced murderer whose golden curls hid a heart of pure ice. That single role made her famous, earned her an Academy Award nomination while she was still a child, and then, in a strange way, may have made the rest of her career harder to build. Patty was born in the year 1945. She came up as a child performer on the stage and on television before landing the role that would define her forever. In the year 1956, she starred in the film The Bad Seed, playing a little girl named Rhoda who appears to be the perfect angelic daughter, but who is, underneath, capable of cold and deliberate violence. It was a bold, disturbing part for anyone, let alone a child, and Patty played it brilliantly. She had already performed the role on the stage, and she brought a frightening control to it on film. Audiences were unsettled and impressed in equal measure. The performance was so strong that the Academy nominated her for a Supporting Actress Oscar, an extraordinary honor for a child. At that moment, Patty McCormack was one of the most talked about young actresses in the country. She had proven she could carry heavy, dark material and hold a whole film in her small hands. By any measure, she had arrived, but the very role that made her famous also boxed her in. When a child becomes that closely tied to a single, unforgettable character, especially a character as strange and specific as the angelic little killer, it can be difficult to convince the industry and the audience to see her as anything else. Patty was so associated with that one chilling little girl that it may have narrowed the paths open to her as she grew. This is a subtler version of the trap that caught so many of these children. It was not that she lacked talent. It was that she had given one performance so singular that it cast a very long shadow. As Patty moved out of childhood, her career changed shape. The adult roles came in a much more sporadic way. She continued to act here and there over the years, taking parts in film and on television across a long stretch of time. But the towering prominence of her Bad Seed moment was never matched again. She largely stepped back from the center of the spotlight and lived a more ordinary working life, appearing when good roles came, but no longer being one of the most famous young faces in the country. In that sense, Patty McCormack's disappearance is a gentle one, and it is more about receding than about crashing. She did not fall into ruin. She did not vanish without a trace. She simply moved from being a sensation to being a working actor who was no longer at the center of everything, and eventually to a quieter kind of presence. The blazing child star faded into a steadier, smaller light. Her story is a useful reminder that even success can trap a child performer. Patty McCormack did nothing wrong. She gave a performance that people still study and admire generations later. But being that good, that young in a role that specific, is its own kind of burden. The little girl with the perfect curls and the cold eyes earned her fame honestly, and then spent the rest of her life as an actor, stepping out from under the enormous shad that one great early role had cast across everything that followed. Jon Provost. If you ask people to name the most famous boy and his dog in television history, a great many of them will describe Jon Provost without knowing his name. He played Timmy on Lassie, and for a whole generation of American children in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Timmy and his collie were as familiar as their own backyards. Jon Provost's story is one of the happier ones on this list because he found the thing that so many child stars never do, which is a way to leave the fame behind without letting it destroy him. Jon was born in the year 1950. He was still very small when he joined the cast of Lassie in the year 1957, taking over as the show moved into its most beloved era. As Timmy, he lived on a farm with the famous dog, and every week the two of them found and solved some new bit of trouble. The show was gentle and warm and hugely popular. Jon Provost grew up on it, quite literally playing Timmy for 7 years, which is an enormous chunk of a childhood to spend in front of a camera. There is a funny piece of American folklore attached to him, which is the endlessly repeated idea of Timmy falling down a well and Lassie running for help. It has become a kind of joke that everyone knows. The strange thing is that it did not actually happen quite the way people remember it, but the fact that the country invented and cherished that memory tells you how deeply Timmy and Lassie sank into the national imagination. Jon Provost, as Timmy, became a permanent part of how a whole generation pictured childhood itself. Then, like every child star before him, he grew up, and the show and the fame were suddenly behind him rather than in front of him. Here is where Jon Provost made the choices that set him apart. Instead of clinging to the spotlight or spiraling in its absence, he stepped away from acting and did something almost radical for a former child star. He went and lived a normal life. He went to college. He worked in ordinary fields, including real estate. He built an existence that had nothing to do with being famous, and he seems to have found real peace in that ordinariness. He did not run from his past either. In later years, he made his peace with having been Timmy. He returned to the public eye on his own comfortable terms, appeared at events, and even wrote a memoir about his life on the show, embracing the well-worn joke rather than resenting it. He became an advocate for animals and for good causes, using the affection people still felt for Timmy and Lassie in a positive way. He turned the fame of his childhood into a warm and manageable part of who he was, rather than a wound that never healed. That is the crucial difference between Jon Provost and the tragic figures on this list. He did disappear from Hollywood as a working actor, which is why he belongs here. The busy child star did not become a busy adult star, but he disappeared into a good and healthy life, one that he chose and shaped for himself. He came through his childhood fame with his sense of self intact, which, when you look at how many of these stories ended, is close to a miracle. When you watch those old Lassie episodes now, and see that small boy running across the farm with his dog. You are seeing one of the lucky ones. Jon Provost was adored by millions as a child, walked away from all of it, and still managed to live a full and grounded life. Among all the vanished children of 1950s and early 1960s television, he is proof that the story does not have to end in sorrow. Philip O. Ford. Philip O. Ford is on this list not because something terrible happened to him, but because of a choice he made that ran completely against the logic of Hollywood. He appeared in one of the most respected films ever made, delivered a wonderful performance, and then, while the door to a real career stood wide open, he simply decided he would rather do something else with his life. His disappearance was voluntary, clear-eyed, and permanent. Philip was born in the year 1948 in the American South. He came into acting as a boy, and in the year 1962, he landed the role that would keep his name alive forever. He played Jem, the older brother, in the film version of To Kill a Mockingbird. That film, drawn from the famous novel, has become a permanent part of American culture, studied in schools, and loved by generation after generation. As Jem, Philip was the boy watching his father stand up for what was right in a deeply unfair world, and he brought a real, natural honesty to the part. He also appeared in other films of the period, including work alongside major stars, so this was no one-time fluke. He could genuinely act by the ordinary rules of the business. A boy who had just appeared to great acclaim in a landmark film should have chased every opportunity that followed. That is what the machine expects. That is what almost everyone does. A role like Jem in a film like that is exactly the launching pad that thousands of young hopefuls dream about and never get. Philip O. Ford had it right there in his hands, and he let it go. As he grew into his teenage years, Philip came to a conclusion that very few child actors ever reach, which is that he simply did not want the actor's life. It was not the tragedy of being rejected. It was the clarity of deciding, for himself, that this was not the road he wanted to walk. He stepped away from acting and turned toward the ordinary world, building a life in business, far from the studios and the premieres, and the whole apparatus of fame. There is something quietly admirable in that. So much of this list is about children who were used up and thrown away, or who could not survive the fall from fame, or who wanted to keep going but were not allowed to. Philip O. Ford is the opposite. He was wanted. He had proven himself in a film that will be remembered for as long as people watch movies. And he looked at the whole glittering thing and decided he would rather have a normal, private, self-directed life. He chose to disappear. That kind of choice takes a certain strength, especially for a young person surrounded by the pull of Hollywood's rewards. It is far easier to be swept along than to step off the path deliberately. Philip O. Ford stepped off. He did not need the fame, and he did not chase it, and he did not let the memory of it define the rest of his years. So when we remember him, we remember a boy who was very good at something, and then walked away from it because he wanted a different life. His disappearance is not a cautionary tale at all. It is almost a reassurance. It says that a child can pass through the strange fire of Hollywood, do fine work, and then simply choose to be an ordinary person and be all right. Every time someone watches To Kill a Mockingbird, they see Philip O. Ford as Jem, frozen forever as that thoughtful boy. And the man himself, having made his choice, lived his real life quietly and on his own terms, exactly as he wanted. Mary Badham, standing right beside Philip O. Ford in that same landmark film, was a little girl who became even more famous than he did, and who then made a very similar choice to walk away. Mary Badham played Scout, the young narrator at the heart of To Kill a Mockingbird, and her performance was so good that it earned her an Academy Award nomination while she was still a child. Then she too set acting aside and turned toward an ordinary life, becoming one of the most celebrated child performers ever to essentially retire before she had even grown up. Mary was born in the year 1952. She was still very young when she was cast as Scout, the sharp, curious, tomboyish little girl through whose eyes the whole story of the film unfolds. It is one of the great child roles in American film because Scout is not a decoration in the story. She is the story. The entire film is filtered through her innocence and her slow, painful education about the unfairness of the adult world. Mary carried that enormous responsibility with a completely unforced naturalness. She did not seem to be acting at all. She seemed simply to be a real child living inside that world. The Academy recognized how remarkable her work was and nominated her for a Supporting Actress Oscar. She was only about 10 years old, which made her one of the youngest performers ever honored in that category. Up to that time, she had reached in a single film, a height that most actors spend entire careers chasing and never touch. The world had every reason to expect a long and glittering career to follow. Instead, Mary Badham essentially retired from acting as a child. She made only a small handful of other appearances in the years right around that film, and then she stepped away from the business almost entirely. While she was still young, she chose a different kind of life, one grounded in family and ordinary work, rather than in the constant churn of Hollywood. For decades, she lived largely outside the industry that had once nominated her for its highest honor. She became involved over the years in things like art and education, building a life that had meaning on its own terms. She never fully closed the door, and much later in life she did make occasional returns to acting, appearing here and there long after her childhood fame. But those were rare visits, not a comeback. For all practical purposes, the little girl who gave one of the finest child performances in film history chose to be an ordinary person instead of a star. That is a genuine disappearance from Hollywood, and a striking one, precisely because it followed such an extraordinary success. Mary Badham's story rhymes with Philip O'Ford's for a reason. The two of them came out of the same beloved film, played brother and sister, reached great heights together, and then both decided that the actor's life was not what they wanted. There is something moving about that shared choice. Two children stood at the very top of what the industry could offer, and both of them, independently, decided that a quiet private life was worth more than continued fame. When people watch To Kill a Mockingbird today, they fall in love with Scout all over again, generation after generation, and the girl who played her, having given the world that unforgettable performance, spent her actual life far from the spotlight, remembered forever as a child on screen, while living quietly as an adult off it. Of all the ways to leave Hollywood behind, choosing to walk away at the very peak, with an Oscar nomination in hand and a whole future available, may be the most remarkable of all. Stephen Arngrim. Stephen Arngrim belongs to the tail end of this era, a child who came up as the 1950s turned into the 1960s, and who found his fame on one of the more colorful television adventures of that later time. His path away from acting is a distinctive one because he did not simply vanish into an ordinary job. He moved sideways into another corner of the creative world, trading the screen for music and the work that happens behind the scenes. Stephen was born in the year 1955. He became known to television audiences for his role on the science fiction adventure series Land of the Giants, where he played Barry, a boy stranded along with a group of travelers in a strange world where everything was enormous and every ordinary object had become a deadly hazard. The show was full of oversized props and imaginative dangers, and Stephen, as the youngest of the stranded group, was a key part of it. For young viewers of the time, he was a familiar face in a wild and memorable television world. Acting ran in his family, which makes his story a little different from the lonely child stars elsewhere on this list. His sister also became a well-known performer, so the world of the industry was not something foreign to him, but something woven into his family life. That may have given him a steadier sense of what the business actually was, and a healthier ability to step away from it when the time came, rather than clinging to fame as the only identity he had ever known. When his time as a child actor wound down, Stephen did not chase adult stardom in the usual way. Instead, he turned toward music, and he became involved in the production side of the creative world. This is a path that a fair number of former performers take because they already understand how shows and recordings are made, and they often find that they enjoy the work of building something more than the work of being the face out front. Stephen followed that pull. He stayed connected to the creative life while stepping out of the spotlight itself. That is a particular kind of disappearance, and an interesting one. Stephen Arngrim did not leave the arts. He simply left the visible, famous part of them. The boy that audiences knew from a hit adventure series, became a working creative person whose efforts went into music and production, rather than into performances the public would see and recognize. He remained an artist, just not a star, and there is a real dignity in that quieter version of a creative life. His story reminds us that not every exit from child stardom is a fall or a flight into ordinary life. Some of these children simply found a different way to keep making things. They loved the creative world enough to stay in it, but they were done with being watched. Stefan Arngrim traded the giant-sized dangers of a television adventure for the steady, unglamorous, satisfying work of helping to build music and shows from behind the curtain. So among the disappeared children of this era, he stands as an example of the sideways path. He did not crash. He did not retreat into a completely separate profession. He carried his creativity from one room of the entertainment house into another, out of the light and into the workshop, and kept right on making things where the audience could not see him. There is a very good chance that you have heard Jimmy Boyd's voice many times in your life without ever knowing his name. Every December, all around the world, people sing along to a certain playful holiday song about a child catching his mother sharing a secret kiss with a certain jolly figure. That song was made famous by Jimmy Boyd when he was just a boy, and it made him, for a moment, one of the most heard child performers in the country. His later life is a quieter story of a career that slowly changed shape as he grew. Jimmy was born in the year 1939. He was a talented young singer, and in the early 1950s, he recorded the cheerful Christmas novelty song that would tie his name to the holiday season forever. The record was a huge hit. A child singing about spying his mother kissing Santa Claus was exactly the kind of sweet, funny thing that captured the public's affection, and the song became a permanent fixture of the season. It has been recorded and played countless times since, and it keeps Jimmy Boyd's original performance alive every single year, whether people know whose voice they first loved or not. That early success made Jimmy famous as a child singer, and he built on it. He was not only a recording act, he also moved into acting, appearing on television and even on the stage as he grew. For a while, he had the kind of double career that many young entertainers dream about, working both as a musical performer and as an actor. He was a genuine talent, not just a one-hit novelty, and he kept himself busy across different corners of show business during his younger years. But musical tastes change, and the world of popular music can be especially unforgiving as the years pass and new styles push out the old. The particular kind of success Jimmy had found as a child singer did not carry forward at the same level into his adult career. His music career gradually declined from its early peak. The novelty of the famous holiday song, which had lifted him so high as a boy, was not something he could simply repeat as a grown man. He continued to work in entertainment in various ways over the years, but the towering fame of that childhood hit was behind him. That is the quiet arc of Jimmy Boyd's story. He did not suffer a dramatic ruin. He did not vanish into scandal or tragedy. He simply experienced the slow fade that catches so many performers whose biggest success comes very early. He kept going, kept working where he could, and lived out a long life, passing away in the year 2009. The child whose voice became part of the sound of Christmas grew into a man whose fame had settled and cooled. Though his most famous recording never stopped playing, there is something fitting and a little bittersweet about Jimmy Boyd. Most child stars, when they fade completely and the public forgets them. Jimmy is different because a piece of his childhood keeps coming back around every winter, playing in stores and homes and on the radio, as beloved as ever. The performer himself faded from the front rank of fame, but the sweet, funny thing he did as a boy became immortal. He disappeared, and yet a part of him, the very best and happiest part, never disappeared at all. It just keeps coming back with the snow. Donna Butterworth had one of the shortest careers of anyone on this list, and that brevity is exactly what makes her a true disappearance. She flashed across the screen as a charming little performer, worked alongside some of the biggest stars of her day, and then stepped out of the business while she was still practically a child. Blink and you would have missed her whole career. And yet, for a brief window in the middle of the 1960s, she was a delightful small presence that audiences genuinely enjoyed. Donna was born in the year 1956. She was a talented and appealing child, the kind who could sing and perform with a confidence far beyond her years. That combination of talent and charm got her noticed, and it got her placed into films alongside major entertainers of the era. She appeared in a comedy with one of the great funnymen of the time, holding her own against a seasoned comic performer, which is no small thing for a young child. She also turned up in a film with one of the most famous singers in the world, sharing the screen with an icon during his own long run of movie roles. For a little girl, that is a remarkable stretch of company to keep. She was not stuck in the background of forgettable pictures. She was placed right beside the headliners, trusted to charm audiences and to perform in her own right. She had a real spark, a natural lickability that came through on screen. By the usual pattern, a child with that kind of early exposure and that kind of talent would have been expected to keep working and building for years to come. But Donna Butterworth did not keep going. Very early, while she was still young, she stepped away from acting almost entirely. Her time as a screen performer was brief and then simply over. She did not fade slowly across a long declining career, the way some of these figures did. She was there and then she was not, having chosen a life away from the cameras before she had even reached her teenage years in the fullest sense. The little girl who had shared the screen with icons became a private person, out of public view. That kind of early exit is its own quiet mystery. There is no dramatic crash to point to, no scandal, no slow professional decline. There is simply a short, bright career, and then a door closing. Whatever the reasons, whether they were personal or practical or simply a family's decision that this life was not the right one for their child, the result was the same. Donna Butterworth left the industry young and did not come back, and she lived the rest of her life far from the fame she had briefly touched. She passed away in the year 2018, having lived a long life after her tiny window of childhood stardom. When you look back at her handful of appearances now, there is a poignancy to them, because you are watching the entire visible career of a talented child, compressed into just a few films. Everything she showed the world, she showed in that short span, and then she kept the rest of her life to herself. Donna Butterworth reminds us that not every child who could have been a star wanted to be one, or was allowed to be one, for very long. Some of them touched that world for a moment, and then let it go completely. Her brief, bright appearances are all that remain in public of a performer who might have done much more, and who instead chose, very early, to simply disappear. Jeffrey Byron represents a particular and very common type of child performer, the kind who works steadily as a young actor without ever becoming a true household name, and who then slides gradually out of the public eye as the years pass. There is no single famous role that everyone remembers him by, and that is part of his story. He was a working young actor rather than a superstar child, and the working actors fade even more quietly than the famous ones do. Jeffrey was born in the year 1955. He came up through the industry as a child and teen performer, taking on the sorts of roles that fill out television shows and films without necessarily landing at the very center of them. This is the daily reality of the business that the public rarely thinks about. For every child who becomes a national sensation, there are many more who are simply reliable young performers, hired to do good work in supporting parts and guest spots. Jeffrey was one of those, a young actor doing the ordinary labor of the trade. That kind of career has its own particular shape and its own particular vulnerability. A child who is not tied to one giant famous role does not have the same permanent place in the public memory. When a superstar child fades, at least people remember the character forever. When a steady working young actor fades, there is often nothing for the audience to hold on to, no single image that keeps the name alive. The work was real and honest, but it did not lodge itself into the culture the way a defining role would have. As Jeffrey Byron moved beyond his childhood roles, his visibility in the mainstream grew more limited. He continued to work in various corners of film and television over time, but he did not rise into lasting fame. The path from busy young performer to widely known adult star is narrow and difficult, and most of the young actors who walk it end up somewhere quieter than the top. Jeffrey's later career unfolded away from the bright center of the industry, in the working margins where a great many capable performers spend their professional lives. That is why he belongs on a list like this, even though his story lacks the drama of the tragic cases. He is representative of the vast, largely invisible group of child performers who were genuinely part of the industry, who did real work as young people, and who then simply receded as the years went on. They did not crash. They did not make headlines. They just gradually stopped being visible, and the public, which had never quite learned their names in the first place, let them go without noticing. There is a kind of honesty in acknowledging performers like Jeffrey Byron, because they are the true majority of what child acting actually produced. The sensations and the tragedies get all the attention, but the reality of the business was always mostly made up of steady, unfamous young workers. Jeffrey did his job, appeared in the productions that hired him, and then moved into a lower-profile life as the momentum of youth faded. So we remember him here not for a towering role or a shocking end, but as an example of the quiet, ordinary fading that swallowed most child performers. He was there, doing the work, part of the machinery of television and film as a young person. And then, without fanfare, he became one of the many, many former child actors whose later lives passed largely out of public view. A working kid who grew up and slipped gently into obscurity. Julia Benjamin's story is a small and gentle one, the tale of a child who appeared on popular family television during the golden age of the sitcom, and then quietly left that world behind. She is another of the performers whose careers were brief, and whose later lives are only lightly documented, which is precisely what earns her a place among the disappeared. She was a familiar young face for a short while, and then she was gone. Julia was born in the year 1957. She came into the business as a child during the era when family comedies dominated American television, the years when nearly every network night was filled with warm, tidy shows about households and their gentle troubles. These programs relied heavily on child performers, because the family sitcom needs children the way a garden needs flowers. Julia was one of the young performers who populated that world, appearing on popular family television in the later part of a show's run, joining the kind of established series that brought in fresh young faces as the years went on. Being brought into a show in its later seasons is a particular kind of role for a child actor. The series is already a going concern, already beloved, already full of established characters and rhythms. A young performer who joins at that stage steps into an existing family rather than helping to build one from the start. It can be a wonderful opportunity, placing a child inside a hit show, but it also means arriving late to something that is already winding toward its natural end. The show has less life left in it, and so the role has less time to grow. For Julia, the work as a child performer did not extend into a large or lasting career. After her time on family television, the roles grew scarce. Her post-childhood work was limited, and she did not make the leap into a busy adult acting life. This is the same wall that stopped so many of the children on this list, the point at which the industry's interest simply does not carry forward. A young performer can be perfectly capable and perfectly likable, and still find that the offers dry up once childhood ends. And so Julia Benjamin, like many others here, faded from the screen and into an ordinary private life. There is no scandal attached to her, no tragedy, no dramatic story of ruin. There is simply a short career on beloved television, and then a quiet departure from the whole world of performing. She became one of the many former child actors whose names appear in old credits, and whose later lives are largely unrecorded in the public sphere. Her story is short because her career was short, and that is honest. Not every child who appeared on television was meant to become a star, and not every one of them wanted to. Some of them had their brief moment inside a hit show, and then went on to live lives that had nothing to do with fame at all. Julia Benjamin belongs to that gentle category, a child of the sitcom era who touched the world of television for a little while, and then let it go. When we remember her, we remember the countless young performers who filled those warm old family shows, most of whom did not become famous adults, and most of whose later lives passed quietly and privately. Julia was one of them, a familiar young face for a season or two, and then a person who simply moved on into the ordinary world, leaving behind only a handful of credits and the soft outline of a career that ended almost as soon as it began. Here is one of the most interesting twists on this entire list, because Morgan Brittany is a child star who genuinely disappeared and then came back as somebody else. Not literally somebody else, but close to it. She faded from the industry as a child performer under one name, and years later, she returned as a glamorous adult star under a different one. Her story is a reminder that a Hollywood disappearance is not always permanent, and that sometimes a vanished child grows into a whole new identity. She was born in the year 1951, and as a child, she performed under her original given name, rather than the stage name the world would later know her by. As a young girl, she worked as a model and an actress, appearing in films and on television during the late 1950s and the 1960s. She was placed in some notable productions of the era, working as one of those pretty, capable child performers who could be trusted in front of a camera. She had a real presence even then, the kind of look and poise that the industry noticed. But as with so many others here, the child performer did not simply glide into an adult career. There was a fade, a quiet stretch where the busy little actress of the earlier years slipped out of prominence. If her story had ended there, she would sit alongside the many other children on this list who touched fame young and then vanished into ordinary life. For a time, that is exactly what she appeared to be, a former child performer who had faded from view. Then came the reinvention. Taking on the stage name by which she is now known, she reemerged as an adult actress, and this time, she found a level of fame that eclipsed anything from her childhood. In the 1970s, and especially the 1980s, she became a familiar and glamorous face on television, best known for her work on one of the great prime-time dramas of that decade. As a scheming, elegant adult character on a hugely popular series, she became a genuine star, watched by millions all over again. The child who had faded had transformed into a celebrated grown woman. That arc is genuinely rare. The overwhelming majority of the children on this list disappeared and stayed disappeared, to fade as a child and then return, years later, as a bigger star than you ever were before, is close to a Hollywood miracle. It required talent, persistence, and probably a fair bit of luck, along with the willingness to essentially start over under a new name and let the public meet her fresh. She managed all of it, turning what could have been a permanent disappearance into merely a long pause between two very different chapters of fame. So Morgan Brittany occupies a special place among the disappeared, because in her case, the disappearance turned out to be temporary. The little girl who worked under her birth name did fade from the industry, which is why she belongs in this story at all. But she then rewrote the ending. She came back, reinvented and renamed, and claimed a stardom in adulthood that the child performer had never reached. Her story offers a small counterweight to all the sadness elsewhere on this list. It says that the door does not always close forever, that a child can vanish from the business and still find a way back in, sometimes bigger than before. Morgan Brittany disappeared and then undisappeared, and in doing so she became living proof that in Hollywood, an ending is sometimes only an intermission. Philip Brown is another of the working young performers whose careers touched this era, and then drifted into relative obscurity, the kind of actor who appeared on television as a young person, without ever climbing to the very top rank of fame. His story, like several others here, is less about a dramatic rise and fall than about the quiet, ordinary fading that swallowed most of the young performers of the age. He was there doing the work, and then he receded into the margins the way so many of them did. Philip was born in the year 1958, which places him among the younger performers connected to this period. He came into the industry as a young actor, and he made appearances on television across the years that followed. This was the daily bread of the business for a great many young people, the guest spots and supporting roles and recurring parts that keep the machinery of television running. Philip was part of that world, one of the young performers who filled out the casts of shows and lent them the young faces that stories so often need. The challenge for a performer in that position is the same challenge that faces so many on this list, only sharper. Without a single defining, famous role to anchor him in the public memory, a working young actor has very little to keep his name alive once the busy years pass. The audience never learns to attach the face to a name they will remember forever. The work is real, and it fills a career for a while, but it does not lodge itself in the culture. When the roles slow down, there is nothing left in the public mind to hold the performer in place. As Philip Brown moved through his career, he did not break through into lasting mainstream fame. He remained one of the many capable performers working at a level below the spotlight, and over time, he became relatively obscure. His name is the kind that appears in old credits and specialized listings, rather than in the general memory of the public. He did the work, but the work did not make him famous in the way that would have kept him visible for decades to come. That is the honest reality of most acting careers, and it is worth acknowledging plainly. The dream of stardom is real for a lucky few, but the everyday truth of the business is that most performers, even talented and hardworking ones, spend their careers somewhere short of fame and then slip quietly out of public view. Philip Brown belongs to that large, mostly unseen group. He was a genuine part of the industry as a young performer, and then, like most of his peers, he faded into the ordinary obscurity that awaits nearly everyone who is not among the tiny handful of true stars. So we remember him here not for a shocking story or a famous role, but as one more example of the quiet fading that defined the majority of young performers from this era. He was there, appearing on television, part of the crowd of young faces that the industry used, and then moved past. And then, without any drama at all, he became one of the many former performers whose later lives unfolded far from any spotlight, remembered mainly in the fine print of old credits. His inclusion matters precisely because his story is so common. For every tragic tale and every miraculous reinvention on this list, there are many more like Philip Brown, capable young people who were part of the machine for a while, and then simply disappeared into ordinary life, leaving behind only a modest trail of work and the faint outline of a career that never quite caught fire. For a stretch in the middle 1950s, if you were a boy in America, there was a fair chance you wanted to be Lee Ocker. He played Rusty, the orphan boy raised by soldiers alongside a heroic German shepherd, on the popular Western adventure series, The Adventures of Rin Tin Tin. He had a dog, a cavalry troop, and a whole frontier fort for a home. Millions of children watched him every week and dreamed of that life. His own life, in the long years after the cameras stopped, turned out to be far harder than anything Rusty ever faced on screen. Lee was born in the year 1943. He started young, appearing in films before landing the role that made him famous, including a memorable part in a John Wayne Western, where he held his own against one of the biggest stars in the world. But it was Rin Tin Tin that made him a household face. As Rusty, the boy who had lost his family and found a new one among the soldiers and their brave dog, Lee was the heart of a show that ran through the second half of the 1950s. He was wholesome, brave, and instantly likable, exactly the kind of boy that young viewers wanted to be, and that parents were happy to have their children watch. Then the series ended, and Lee Ocker ran straight into the same wall that stopped nearly every child on this list. The fame did not carry forward. The roles that a former child star hopes for did not arrive. As he grew out of boyhood, the industry that had built the show around him lost interest, and Lee found himself, still young, on the outside of the only world he had really known. The transition out of child stardom, which is brutal for almost everyone who tries to make it, was brutal for him too. Lee did not become a working adult actor. Instead, he drifted into ordinary jobs, the way many of these children did when acting fell away. He worked with his hands over the years, taking on trades and various kinds of labor far from any studio. There was no glamour in it, no second act of fame, just the slow, ordinary work of getting by. And as the decades passed, life grew genuinely difficult for the man who had once been every boy's television hero. His later years included real hardship, including a stretch when he had very little and was struggling badly. The boy who had lived in a fort with a heroic dog on television ended up facing the kind of quiet poverty and struggle that the public never associates with a former star. It is one of the more sobering turns on this list, because Rusty had seemed so secure and so beloved, and the reality of the man's later life was so much colder than that bright childhood image. There is a small measure of grace near the end, because people who remembered the show and cared about him did eventually reach out and offer help when his situation became hard. The affection that audiences had felt for Rusty all those years earlier did not entirely disappear, and it counted for something when he needed it. Lee Ocker lived until the year 2021, passing away as one of the last links to a beloved chapter of 1950s television. His story is a hard one, and it deserves to be told plainly. Lee Ocker gave a generation of children a hero to look up to, and then he spent much of his own adult life in obscurity and difficulty. Far from the warmth of that fame, the gap between Rusty's secure television world and the man's real struggles is exactly the kind of gap this whole list is about. He was adored, and then he was forgotten, and the forgetting cost him dearly. Robby Benson sits at a slightly later edge of this era, and his story runs in an unusual direction because he did not so much disappear as transform. He began as a young performer, rose to real prominence as a teen idol, and then, rather than fading into obscurity, quietly reinvented himself into a working creative person whose most famous contribution most people have heard without ever seeing his face. His is a disappearance of a very particular kind, the disappearance of the visible star into the invisible craftsman. Robby was born in the year 1956. He came up as a young actor and found his greatest fame a bit later than the true 1950s children, rising to prominence as a sensitive, appealing young leading man in a run of films aimed at younger audiences. For a while, he was a genuine heartthrob, the kind of earnest, gentle young star whose face turned up on magazine covers and whose films drew crowds of young fans. He had the looks and the softness and the sincerity that made him a natural for those emotional, youthful roles. But teen idol fame is one of the most fragile kinds of fame there is. It burns bright and then burns out, because the very quality that makes it work, youth, is the one thing that cannot last. The young leading man of one era becomes an ordinary grown actor in the next, and the enormous fan devotion of the teenage years rarely follows a performer into adulthood. Robby, like every teen idol before and after him, eventually aged out of that particular kind of stardom, and the intense spotlight of his youth dimmed. What sets him apart is what he did next. Rather than clinging to a fading leading man career or vanishing entirely, Robby moved toward the creative work that happens away from the camera. He went into directing. He became a teacher, sharing his knowledge of the craft with others. And in one memorable case, he lent his voice to an animated character in a hugely beloved film, giving a full performance that reached an enormous audience without a single person seeing his actual face on screen. Countless people have heard him and loved his work in that role without ever connecting it to the young star he once was. That is a genuinely interesting way to leave the spotlight. Robby Benson did not lose his place in the creative world. He simply moved out of view, from being the watch to being the maker. The face that once sold magazines gave way to the voice, the director's chair, and the classroom. He remained an artist, deeply involved in the work, but he stepped out of the exposed, vulnerable position of being a famous face and into the steadier, quieter satisfactions of craft and teaching. He also faced serious personal challenges over the years, including significant health struggles that would have derailed many careers entirely. That he continued to work and create through all of it speaks to a real toughness underneath the gentle image of his youth. The soft young heartthrob turned out to be a durable and dedicated creative professional, one who kept building long after the fan magazines had moved on to newer faces. So Robby Benson belongs on this list as a disappearance of transformation rather than of ruin. The teen idol did vanish, in the sense that the famous young face stepped out of the spotlight and largely stopped being a visible star. But the person did not disappear at all. He simply changed what he did, moving from being seen to being heard, from being adored to being useful. Of all the paths off the stage that these children took, his is one of the most graceful, a star who chose to become a craftsman and found real purpose in the trade. Some child actors are remembered for playing the hero, or the sweet little sibling, or the tragic figure. Frank Bank is remembered for playing the friend, specifically the somewhat dim, endlessly hungry pal on one of the most beloved family comedies in television history. And his second act is one of the most satisfying and surprising on this whole list, because the boy who played a bit of a goof grew up to become a genuinely successful man in the hard-nosed world of finance. Frank was born in the year 1942. He became famous on the classic series Leave It to Beaver, playing Lumpy, the neighborhood friend who was a little slow, a little clumsy, and often the butt of the joke. Lumpy was not the star of the show, but he was one of its most memorable characters, exactly the kind of familiar supporting figure that makes a television world feel real and lived in. Through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, Frank Bank was Lumpy, and millions of viewers knew that big, goofy, good-natured face, as well as they knew the show's leads. Playing a character like Lumpy carries its own particular risk for a young actor. When you become that closely associated with a specific comic type, especially a slightly foolish one, it can be very hard to be taken seriously as anything else. The audience sees Lumpy, not the actor. And when the show ends, a performer so tied to one broad comic role often finds that the industry cannot imagine him doing anything different. That is a real trap, and it has ended plenty of young careers. Frank Bank did not fight that trap by struggling to become a different kind of actor. Instead, he did something far smarter and far more unusual. He walked away from acting almost entirely and built a completely different career in the world of money and investments. He became a successful financial professional, working in the demanding, competitive field of stocks and bonds, and helping clients manage their fortunes. The boy who had played a lovable dim bulb on television turned out to be a sharp, capable businessman with a real head for figures. Think about how satisfying that reversal is. The whole joke of Lumpy was that he was not very bright. The reality of Frank Bank was that he was clever enough to leave the fragile world of acting and thrive in one of the most numbers-driven professions there is. He beat the child star trap not by clinging to fame, but by abandoning it for something more stable, and he did very well for himself in the process. He proved, in the most concrete way possible, that the goofy character had nothing to do with the intelligent man who played him. He never lost his affection for his television past, and in his later years, he embraced the Lumpy legacy with good humor, even writing a memoir that leaned into the character that had made him famous. He had made his peace with being remembered as the neighborhood goof, precisely because his real life had turned out so differently. The fame of his childhood became a fond old story rather than a burden, because he had built a solid grown-up life entirely on his own terms. Frank Bank passed away in the year 2013, remembered warmly both as Lumpy and as a man who had reinvented himself completely. His disappearance from acting was total, but it led somewhere good. He is one of the clearest examples on this list of a child star who looked at the fragile, cruel business that had made him famous, decided he wanted something steadier, and went out and got it. The boy who played the fool was, in the end, one of the wisest of them all. Chet Allen's story is one of the saddest and most fragile on this list, and it centers on the cruelest trap that can catch a particular kind of child performer. His entire early fame rested on a gift that was guaranteed to vanish with time: the pure, high, unbroken voice of a boy. When nature took that voice away, as it always does, it took the foundation of his fame with it, and the years that followed were marked by struggle and, in the end, real tragedy. Chet was born in the year 1939. He was a boy soprano, blessed with the kind of clear, soaring young voice that can stop a room. That gift led him to a remarkable early honor. He was chosen to originate the title role in a famous television opera about a poor crippled boy who is visited by the three kings on their way to see the newborn Jesus. Broadcast on television during the holiday season, it became a cherished production, and young Chet, singing the lead, was at the very center of it. For a boy soprano, it was about as high as you could climb. But a boy soprano's career carries a countdown clock that no talent and no discipline can stop. The voice that makes such a child special is the voice of childhood itself, and childhood ends. When a boy reaches a certain age, his voice changes and deepens, and the pure high sound that made him famous is simply gone forever, replaced by an ordinary adult voice. For most boys, that change is just a normal part of growing up. For a boy whose entire fame was built on that vanishing voice, it can be the end of everything he has known. That is what happened to Chet Allen. The gift that had made him a young star aged out from under him, exactly as it was always going to. And unlike an actor, who might grow into new kinds of roles, a boy soprano who loses his voice loses the very thing that defined him, with nothing automatic to replace it. The career that had reached such heights so early did not have a natural next chapter. Chet found himself, still young, having already peaked, with the source of his fame permanently behind him. The years that followed were hard. Chet struggled, and his struggles included the kind of deep personal and mental health difficulties that can shadow a life. The path from celebrated child performer to a settled adult existence, which is treacherous for everyone on this list, was especially treacherous for a young man whose one great gift had already been taken away by time itself. He carried burdens that went well beyond the ordinary difficulty of a faded career. Chet Allen's life came to a sorrowful end in the year 1984. He died young, having never found a way to rebuild the kind of prominence he had known as a boy, singing that famous holiday role. His is one of the genuinely tragic disappearances on this list. The story of a child whose brilliant early fame rested entirely on something that could not last, and who was left, once it was gone, to face the rest of his life without the thing that had once made him shine. There is a particular ache in Chet Allen's story, because his gift was so beautiful and so doomed at the same time. Every boy soprano is living on borrowed time, singing with a voice that will disappear. Most of them grow up and move on to ordinary lives. But for the ones who tasted real fame while that voice lasted, the loss of it can be devastating. Chet reached the very top of what a boy's voice could achieve, and then he spent his remaining years in the long shadow that fell once the singing had to stop. Kevin Corcoran. If Bobby Driscoll was the first great Disney child star, then Kevin Corcoran was one of the most beloved of the wave that followed. For a good stretch of the late 1950s and early 1960s, he was everywhere in the Disney world, a freckled, energetic, endlessly likable boy who turned up in film after film. And his story has one of the happiest and most stable endings on this entire list, because he never really left the industry at all. He just moved to the other side of the camera and stayed there for the rest of his working life. Kevin was born in the year 1949. He became a fixture of Disney productions, so much so that he earned a permanent nickname, Moochie, from one of his recurring roles. He appeared in some of the most cherished Disney films of the era. He was the boy in the heartbreaking story of a family and their brave yellow dog. He was part of the shipwrecked family, building a life on a tropical island. He turned up in comedies and adventures, always bringing the same bright, boyish energy that audiences adored. For young viewers of the time, Kevin Corcoran was simply part of the Disney family, as familiar as the mouse himself. That kind of constant work as a child can be a blessing and a burden at once. Kevin was busy, beloved, and secure inside the Disney machine for years. But every child star, even a Disney one, eventually grows up, and the roles that suit a lively little boy do not automatically continue for a young man. As Kevin aged out of his childhood parts, the flood of on-screen work that had defined his early years began to slow, and he faced the same crossroads that every child on this list reached sooner or later. Here is where Kevin Corcoran made the choice that saved him from the fate of so many others. Rather than clinging to acting or drifting away entirely, he stayed in the industry by moving into the work that happens behind the scenes. He became a professional in production, taking on the unglamorous but essential jobs of actually making television and film. He worked as a production manager, a director, and a producer, building a long and steady career as one of the people who make shows happen rather than one of the faces the audience sees. That is a genuinely wonderful outcome for a former child star. Kevin took everything he had learned as a boy on all those sets, the rhythms of production, the way a shoot actually works, the craft of making entertainment, and he turned it into a durable adult profession. He did not have to depend on the fickle affection of the audience or on staying young and cute. He had real skills, and he put them to work in a career that lasted for decades. The famous freckled boy became a respected working professional, a valued part of the industry, long after his own child stardom had ended. He kept at that work steadily over the years, contributing to many productions in various behind-the-scenes roles. His name may not have stayed famous, but his work continued, quietly and reliably, inside the very business that had made him a star as a child. He had found a way to belong to Hollywood permanently, not as a fading former kid, but as a working craftsman with a real trade. Kevin Corcoran passed away in the year 2015. Having lived a full life inside the industry, he had joined as a small boy. His disappearance from the screen was complete, but it was not a fall. He simply changed jobs, trading the spotlight for the steadier satisfactions of production work. Among all the children on this list, he is one of the finest examples of a graceful transition, a beloved young star who grew up, stepped behind the camera, and made a whole life out of the business he loved. The boy called Moochie found a way to stay home in Hollywood, and he did it on his own solid terms. Donald Keeler. Donald Keeler belongs to that group of child performers whose fame was real but modest, tied to a single familiar role in a hugely popular show, and whose later life passed almost entirely out of the public record. He was a recognizable young face to a generation of television viewers, and then he stepped away into a private life so quiet that the trail behind him grows faint very quickly. His is the kind of gentle, near-total disappearance that this list is full of, the working child who simply melts back into ordinary life. Donald came up as a young performer during the great age of family television, and he found his place on one of the most beloved shows of the era, the long-running series about a boy and his heroic colleague. He played one of the young supporting characters, a friend to the show's central boy, part of the warm rural world that the program created week after week. For young viewers, he was a familiar face in that television neighborhood, one of the children who populated the gentle stories and made the whole world feel real and full. Playing a supporting role on a hit show is a particular kind of childhood fame. You are seen by millions. You are part of something enormously popular, and yet you are not the star. The audience knows your face without necessarily knowing your name. That position gives a young performer real exposure, but very little of the permanent attachment that keeps a name alive for decades. When the role ends, there is often nothing for the public to hold on to, no single defining image strong enough to keep the performer in the collective memory. That is very much what happened to Donald Keeler. His time as a familiar young face on that popular series was his moment in the spotlight, and when it passed, so did his prominence. He did not go on to a large or lasting acting career. The offers that might carry a child performer into an adult career did not materialize, or he chose not to pursue them, and either way the result was the same. He faded from the screen while he was still young. What followed was a quiet, low-profile life, largely out of public view. There is very little in the documented record about Donald Keeler's later years, which is itself the whole point of his inclusion here. He is one of the many child performers who touched fame briefly through a single popular role and then simply disappeared into the ordinary world, leaving behind only that handful of familiar appearances and very little else that the public ever learned. This kind of story is far more common than the dramatic ones, even if it gets far less attention. For every child star who crashed spectacularly or reinvented themselves triumphantly, there were many like Donald Keeler, capable young performers who had their brief moment on a beloved show and then receded into private lives that the cameras never followed. The fame was real while it lasted, and then it was gone, and the person went on to live a life that had nothing more to do with the public. So we remember Donald Keeler as one of those quiet vanishings. He was a familiar young face in one of the most cherished television worlds of the era, part of a show that millions loved. And then, like so many of his fellow child performers, he stepped out of that world and into an ordinary existence that left almost no public trace. His is a small story, but it is an honest one, and it stands for the countless young performers whose fame was brief and whose later lives were their own. Janet Burston, Janet Burston reaches back to the very earliest edge of this era, a child performer whose fame stretched out of the 1940s and touched the beginning of the 1950s, before fading almost completely. She was a holdover from one of the most famous collections of child actors in film history, and like so many of her fellow young performers, she left behind only a modest trail of work before disappearing into a private adult life. Her story is short, but it connects this list to the deeper roots of child stardom in America. Janet was born in the year 1935. She came up as a young performer during the long-running series of short comedies, featuring a rotating cast of children, the beloved gang of kids, whose adventures had entertained audiences for years. She was one of the later children to appear in that famous group, joining as the series moved through its final phase. Being part of that particular collection of child performers connected her to a genuine institution of American entertainment, one of the most enduring showcases for young talent that Hollywood ever produced. But joining a famous series in its later stages is a particular kind of opportunity, and a limited one. The most celebrated era of those comedies had already passed by the time Janet came along, and the whole enterprise was winding toward its end. A child who arrives late to a long-running institution steps into something that is already fading, and the platform that once launched famous young careers offers less lift by the time its final children come aboard. Janet's connection to that famous gang was real, but it came near the close of the story rather than at its height. As that chapter of her childhood ended, Janet's on-screen work grew limited. She did not go on to a large or lasting acting career. The later credits are few, and the momentum of her early involvement did not carry her into a busy adult life in the business. This is the same wall that stopped nearly everyone on this list. And for a child whose fame was already tied to the tail end of a fading institution, the drop-off came quickly and quietly. What followed was the familiar pattern of a private life, largely out of public view. The documented record of Janet Burston's later years is thin, and she lived most of her life far from any spotlight. She passed away in the year 1998, having spent the great bulk of her life as an ordinary private person rather than a performer. The little girl who had been part of one of film's most famous groups of children became, like most of them, an adult whose life the public never followed. There is something quietly meaningful in remembering a performer like Janet Burston, precisely because her fame was so modest and her later life so private. She was part of something famous, a real thread in the long history of American child entertainment, and then she slipped away into the ordinary world without fanfare. Most of the children who passed through those famous comedies ended up exactly like this, briefly part of something beloved, and then gone from public view for good. So Janet Burston stands here as a link to the earliest roots of this whole phenomenon, a child performer whose fame reached from the 1940s into the beginning of the 1950s, before quietly ending. She was one of the many young faces that filled a famous institution and then disappeared, leaving behind only a handful of appearances and the soft outline of a life lived mostly away from the cameras that had briefly made her known. Wally Albright takes us even further back in time than most of the names on this list, all the way to the earliest days of the child star system, when the movies were still young, and the whole idea of the professional child performer was just taking shape. His career stretched across an earlier era and touched the edges of this one, and his later life, like so many here, faded into obscurity far from the fame he had known as a boy. He is one of the oldest links in this long chain of vanished child performers. Wally was born in the year 1925, which made him a genuine child of the earliest sound film era. He worked as a young performer during the 1930s, appearing in films at a time when Hollywood itself was still figuring out what it was. He was part of the first real generation of movie child actors, the children who came up alongside the birth of the modern film industry. His work extended across that early period, including a connection to some of the famous ensembles of children that the studios loved to feature. Being a child star in that earliest era carried its own particular challenges. The whole system for handling young performers was still primitive. There were fewer protections, less understanding of what constant work did to a child, and a rougher, more chaotic industry all around. A boy actor of the 1930s was working in a business that was inventing its rules as it went, and the support that a child performer might receive was thin at best. Wally came up inside that raw early machine, one of the young faces helping to define what a movie child even was. As the years passed and Wally grew out of boyhood, his career followed the same downward arc that caught nearly every child performer of every era. The roles that suit a young child do not continue for a grown man, and the transition into an adult career is a wall that most never climb. Wally's on-screen work diminished as he aged, and the fame he had known as a boy in those early films did not carry forward into adulthood. He faded from the screen, joining the long line of child stars whose prominence ended with childhood itself. His adult life passed largely in obscurity, away from the industry that had employed him as a boy. The detailed public record of his later years is thin, and he lived most of his long life far from any spotlight. He passed away in the year 1999, having spent the overwhelming majority of his years as a private person rather than a performer. The boy who had been part of the earliest generation of movie children grew into an ordinary man whose later life the public never tracked. Wally Albright matters on this list because he reaches back to the very beginning of the whole phenomenon, long before the 1950s children, before the television child stars, before any of the more famous names here. There were boys like Wally working in the raw early days of the movies. He was part of that first wave, and he suffered the same fate that would befall almost all the waves that followed. The industry used its children and then moved past them, generation after generation, and Wally Albright was one of the earliest to live that pattern, so we remember him as a kind of ancestor to everyone else on this list, a child of the earliest film era, whose fame faded just as surely as the fame of the children who came decades after him. He was there at the beginning, one of the first professional movie children, and he ended his life in the same quiet obscurity that swallowed so many of the young performers who came after. His story is a reminder that the disappearance of the child star is not a new thing at all. It is as old as the movies themselves. There is a very good chance that you have watched Bobby Anderson many times without ever knowing it, because he appeared as a boy in one of the most watched films in the history of the world. Every holiday season, families gather to watch a certain beloved story about a good man who learns what his life has meant. And in the early part of that film, a young boy plays the hero as a child. That boy was Bobby Anderson, and his life is a lovely example of a child performer who found a lasting home inside the industry, just not in front of the camera. Bobby was born in the year 1933. He worked as a child actor across the late 1930s and into the 1940s, appearing in a range of films in the supporting roles that young performers filled. But his single most enduring moment came in a treasured holiday film released in the year 1946, in which he played the beloved main character as a boy. There is a famous early scene where the young hero saves his little brother from drowning in the icy water, and another where he stands up to a grieving pharmacist and stops him from making a terrible mistake. In those scenes, it is Bobby Anderson carrying the childhood of a character that hundreds of millions of people have since come to love. That is a remarkable thing to have done. Most child actors, even famous ones, fade from memory as the years pass. But Bobby Anderson is embedded forever in a film that gets watched by new audiences every single year, generation after generation. His boyhood performance has effectively become immortal, replayed endlessly around the world, even as his name went almost entirely unknown to the very audiences who loved his work. He is one of the most seen and least recognized child performers imaginable. As Bobby grew up, the on-screen roles thinned out the way they did for nearly every child actor. The transition into an adult acting career, that near impossible wall, was not the path his life would take. But Bobby Anderson did not leave the industry. Instead, like several of the wisest figures on this list, he moved into the working world behind the camera, where the real machinery of filmmaking lives. He built a long career in production, taking on the demanding jobs that make films and television actually happen, including work as an assistant director and in production management. That is a genuinely happy outcome. Bobby took the knowledge he had absorbed as a child on movie sets, the deep understanding of how a production really works, and he turned it into a durable adult profession. He spent his working life inside the business he had joined as a boy, contributing to the making of films and shows in the essential, unglamorous roles that keep everything running. He did not need to stay famous or stay young. He had a real trade, and he practiced it for decades. He lived until the year 2008, remembered by film lovers as the boy who played the beloved hero's childhood in that immortal holiday movie, and remembered within the industry as a solid working professional who had spent his life making pictures. His disappearance from the screen was complete, but his connection to the craft never broke. He simply moved from being watched to being one of the people who make the watching possible. Bobby Anderson stands as another fine example of the graceful exit. He gave the world an unforgettable few minutes of childhood performance, tucked inside a film that will be loved forever. And then he built a whole quiet career behind the scenes of the industry he loved. The boy who saved his brother on the ice grew up to spend his life helping to make the movies. And there are few better ways for a child star to disappear than that. Sonny Bupp reaches back to the earliest and grandest edge of this whole story, because his final film as a child is widely considered one of the greatest movies ever made. He was a working child actor of an earlier era, whose small career ended almost as soon as it touched greatness, and whose adult life then unfolded in complete ordinary privacy. His is a story of a boy who brushed against cinematic immortality and then simply walked away into a normal life. Sonny was born in the year 1928, which places him among the earliest children connected to this list, a performer of the 1930s and very early 1940s. He worked as a young actor during that period, appearing in a series of films in the small roles that child performers were given. He was one of the many boys who filled out the casts of movies during the raw, energetic early years of the sound film era, doing honest work in modest parts. His most famous and most remarkable credit came in the year 1941, when he appeared in a film that would go on to be hailed by many as the finest ever made. In that towering movie about the rise and fall of a powerful, lonely man, Sonny played the tycoon's young son, appearing as the child of the central character during the sweep of that ambitious story. It is an astonishing thing to have on your resume, to have been a small part of a film that critics and scholars would spend the next many decades calling a masterpiece. And here is the poignant part. That celebrated film was essentially the last of his career. He touched greatness, and then his time as an actor came to an end. Sonny left acting while he was still young, stepping away from the business before he had even fully grown up. This was not a dramatic fall or a public collapse. It was simply the quiet end of a modest child career, the kind that thousands of young performers experienced. The difference is only that Sonny's final act happened to be inside one of the most important films ever produced, which gives his small exit an unusual grandeur in hindsight. Most child actors fade after forgettable pictures. Sonny faded right after appearing in an immortal one. His adult life then unfolded far from Hollywood, in ordinary and private ways. Like many young men of his generation, his path led him toward the wider world beyond the movies. He lived out the great majority of his life as a private citizen, with the public taking little notice of the former child actor who had once appeared in that famous film. He passed away in the year 2007, having spent nearly his entire life outside the industry that had briefly employed him as a boy. There is a quiet beauty in Sonny Bupp's story. He was not a star, not a sensation, not a tragedy. He was an ordinary working child actor who happened, at the very end of his small career, to be part of something extraordinary, and who then simply grew up and lived a normal life. He carried within him a genuine piece of film history, a real connection to one of the greatest movies ever made, and he wore it lightly, going about his ordinary years without fanfare. So we remember Sonny Bupp as the boy who touched greatness and then let it go. He appeared in an immortal film and then disappeared into an ordinary life, which is its own kind of grace. Not everyone who brushes against cinematic history needs to hold on to it. Sonny had his brief moment inside a masterpiece, and then he closed the door on acting and lived the rest of his life as his own private person, quietly carrying a small famous secret through all his ordinary years. Darryl Hickman had one of the longest and most winding relationships with the acting business of anyone on this list. He began as a child performer in the earliest era, worked on and off across an enormous span of years, and then, rather than simply fading away, reinvented himself several times over into a teacher, an executive, and a writer. His is a story not of disappearance, so much as of constant transformation, a life spent circling in and out of an industry he never fully left behind. Darryl was born in the year 1931. He started acting as a very young child in the late 1930s, appearing in serious and important films while he was still small. He was a genuinely gifted dramatic child, capable of real emotional depth, and he was cast in some weighty and respected pictures during the 1940s. He overlapped with the 1950s as well, continuing to take roles as he moved through his teenage years. He was also part of an acting family with a younger brother who would go on to his own television fame, so the business was woven into his life from the beginning. Unlike many child stars, Darryl did not hit a single hard wall and vanish. His career instead stretched out in a long, uneven line, with busy stretches and quiet stretches spread across many years. He kept acting into adulthood, taking roles here and there over a very long span, never quite becoming a huge adult star, but never quite disappearing either. He belongs on this list not because he crashed, but because his child fame faded into a much more scattered and lower-profile adult working life, full of gaps and pivots. What makes Darryl especially interesting is everything he did beyond acting. He became deeply thoughtful about the craft itself, and he turned that thoughtfulness into a whole second life as a teacher. He became a respected acting coach, helping other performers understand the work from the inside. He also moved into the business side of the industry, taking on an executive role in the world of daytime television, one of the people who helped decide what actually gets made and how. And he became a writer, setting down his ideas about acting and his reflections on a life spent in and around the business. That is a remarkably full and varied life for a former child star. Darryl Hickman refused to be defined by any single chapter. He was the gifted dramatic child, and then the scattered adult actor, and then the coach, and then the executive, and then the author. He kept finding new ways to be useful, new rooms of the entertainment house to work in, new things to teach and to build. The child fame that trapped so many others became, for him, just the first of many phases in a long and restless creative life. He lived a long life, remaining connected to the craft and its people across the decades. His path shows that a child performer does not have to be swallowed by a single fate. Darryl kept moving, kept reinventing, kept turning his early experience into new kinds of work. And in doing so, he built a life that was rich and various, rather than defined by the fading of a childhood career. So Darryl Hickman stands on this list as a figure of transformation. Yes, his child stardom faded, and his adult acting career was scattered and uneven, which is why he belongs here among the vanished. But he never truly vanished, because he kept becoming new things. Of all the ways to survive the strange trap of child fame, his may be the most active and the most self-directed, a life spent endlessly reinventing itself in and around the industry that first claimed him as a small boy. Of all the disappearances on this list, Dean Stockwell's may be the most literal and the most dramatic, because he did not fade away by accident. He walked away on purpose, more than once, turning his back on fame at the height of it and vanishing into ordinary life, only to return years later and build one of the most respected and enduring careers of anyone here. His life is a series of disappearances and reappearances, a man who kept leaving Hollywood and kept coming back, on his own terms every time. Dean was born in the year 1936. He became a major child star in the 1940s, one of the most prominent young performers at a great studio. He appeared in big, beloved films, including a famous musical and a striking, unusual picture about a boy whose hair mysteriously turns a strange color. He was thoughtful, sensitive, and enormously talented, and for a stretch, he was one of the most notable child actors in the entire business. His childhood fame was the real thing, built on genuine ability and prominent roles in significant films. But Dean Stockwell did something almost unheard of for a child star. As he grew toward adulthood, he came to resent the whole apparatus of fame, the loss of a normal childhood, the constant work, the feeling of being a product rather than a person. And so he quit. He walked away from acting and went off to live an ordinary life, taking regular jobs and moving through the world as a private young man rather than a former star. He disappeared from the industry not because it rejected him, but because he rejected it. He wanted to be free of it, and so he left. That could have been the end of his story. Another child star who vanished into ordinary life. But Dean's relationship with acting turned out to be far more complicated than a simple exit. He came back. As a young adult, he returned to the screen and reinvented himself as a serious dramatic actor, taking on challenging grown-up roles and proving that the gifted child had become a gifted man. And then, restless as ever, he drifted away again, spending stretches of his life outside the business, associating with artists and free spirits, living according to his own restless nature, rather than the demands of a career. The most remarkable part came later still. After years of coming and going, Dean Stockwell mounted one of the great comebacks in the history of the business, emerging in his middle age as a beloved and acclaimed character actor. He turned in memorable performances in important films, earned major recognition including an Academy Award nomination, and became a familiar and cherished presence on a hugely popular television series, where a whole new generation came to love him without ever knowing he had been a child star, or that he had walked away so many times. The boy who had quit Hollywood in disgust became, decades later, one of its most respected veterans. That arc is extraordinary. Most of the children on this list disappeared once and stayed gone. Dean Stockwell disappeared over and returned over and over, living a life that refused every simple category. He proved that a child star could walk away from fame entirely, live an ordinary life, and still come back to build something great, all while remaining stubbornly, thoroughly himself. He was never trapped by his childhood fame, because he was always willing to leave it behind whenever it stopped serving him. Dean Stockwell lived a long, full, remarkable life, working steadily and admirably into his later years, before passing away in the year 2021. He belongs on this list because he disappeared, again and again, more deliberately than anyone else here. But his story is ultimately one of triumph, the tale of a man who refused to be owned by fame, who kept walking away and kept coming back, and who ended up with a career and a life that were entirely, defiantly his own. Billy Mumy is one of the most familiar faces of 1960s television, a child actor whose work reached back into the very start of the decade, and who created one of the most genuinely frightening child characters in the history of the medium. His story is less a disappearance than a fading of one particular kind of fame, because he never really left the creative world at all. He simply grew up out of his child stardom and kept right on working across an astonishingly varied career. Billy was born in the year 1954. He began working very young, and one of his earliest and most unforgettable roles came at the start of the 1960s, on a famous anthology series known for its strange and unsettling stories. In one legendary episode, he played a small boy with terrifying, godlike powers, a child who could bend the whole world to his whims, and who punished anyone who displeased him in horrifying ways. It remains one of the most disturbing and iconic performances a child has ever given on television, a genuinely chilling piece of work from a very young actor. That episode alone secured Billy Mumy a permanent place in television history. His most sustained childhood fame came a bit later, when he starred as the young boy in a popular science fiction series about a family lost among the stars. As the clever, brave youngest member of that stranded space family, he became a familiar and beloved face to young viewers, one of the most recognizable children on television during that run. He was the resourceful boy at the heart of the adventure, and for a stretch, he was as well known as any child performer of his moment. Then, of course, he grew up, and the specific fame of being a famous television child faded, as it always does. But this is where Billy Mumy's story diverges sharply from most of the others on this list. He did not disappear, he did not fall, he simply kept working, moving fluidly across the creative world for the rest of his life. He continued acting as an adult, taking roles across many years, including a significant part on another well-known science fiction series that a later generation came to love. Beyond acting, Billy poured himself into music, becoming a genuine and dedicated musician and songwriter, part of a musical act that produced a famously oddball novelty hit and a great deal of other work over the years. He also moved into writing, working in the world of comics and storytelling. He became, in effect, a lifelong creative professional, endlessly productive across acting, music, and writing, never confined to any single lane. The child fame that trapped so many others was, for him, just the first chapter of a long and busy creative life. That is why Billy Mummy's place on this list comes with an important qualification. His childhood stardom did fade, in the sense that the famous television boy grew up and was no longer that boy. But he himself never vanished. He remained a working, creating, contributing artist for decades, beloved by fans of his many different projects across the years. He is proof that a child star can grow up, lose the specific fame of childhood, and still build a rich and lasting creative life without ever really leaving the arts behind. So we remember Billy Mummy not as a tragedy or a cautionary tale, but as one of the survivors, a former child star who kept working and kept creating across an entire lifetime. The terrifying boy from that famous episode and the brave boy lost in space grew into a durable, versatile, endlessly busy creative man. His childhood fame faded, but his creativity never did, and that makes him one of the most reassuring figures on this entire list. Angela Cartwright grew up in front of American audiences across some of the most beloved productions of her era, moving from a hit television comedy to a legendary movie musical to a famous science fiction series, all while she was still a child and teenager. And then, as an adult, she gently stepped back from performing and built a rich creative life in a completely different art form. Her disappearance from the screen was a quiet, deliberate turn toward a new way of making things, and it is one of the more graceful transitions on this list. Angela was born in the year 1952. She became familiar to television audiences in the late 1950s as a young daughter on a popular family comedy, one of the child performers who grew up on screen in the warm world of the sitcom. But her childhood work reached far beyond that. She appeared as one of the children in a magnificent and enduring movie musical, a film so beloved that it has been watched by generation after generation, forever preserving her as one of the singing children in that famous family. And she took a leading young role on a well-known science fiction adventure series, playing one of the children in a family lost among the stars, which made her a familiar face to yet another audience. That is a genuinely impressive body of childhood work, spread across 3 very different and very beloved productions. Angela was not a one-role child star. She was a versatile young performer who moved comfortably between comedy, musical film, and science fiction adventure, becoming a recognizable presence across multiple corners of the entertainment world. By the time she reached adulthood, she had already been part of more cherished productions than most performers manage in an entire career. As she grew up, though, Angela did not push hard to build a big adult acting career. The intense fame of her childhood work settled into something quieter, and her on-screen appearances grew more occasional. But rather than simply fading into ordinary life or struggling with the loss of fame, Angela turned her creative energy in a new direction entirely. She became a visual artist and a photographer, developing a genuine second career in the making of images. She built a body of artistic work and even ran her own creative business, channeling the same creative spirit that had made her a performer into a new and lasting form. That is a lovely way to leave the screen behind. Angela Cartwright did not need the camera to keep pointing at her. She found her own way to keep creating, moving from being a subject of images to being a maker of them, from performing other people's stories to crafting her own art. She stepped out of the spotlight not because she had run out of options, but because she found a different creative path that suited her, and she pursued it with real dedication over many years. So Angela belongs on this list as a gentle, self-directed disappearance. The famous child of the comedy, the musical, and the space adventure grew up and quietly redirected her life toward visual art, leaving the constant exposure of performing for the more private satisfactions of her own creative work. She did not vanish into ruin or into ordinary anonymity. She vanished into a whole new art form, one that she made her own. Her story, like several of the happiest ones here, reminds us that leaving Hollywood is not always a loss. For some of these children, stepping away from the screen was simply a matter of finding a better fit for the person they were becoming. Angela Cartwright had given audiences a great deal of joy as a child across some truly beloved productions, and then she claimed a creative adult life on her own terms, trading the camera that had watched her for the camera she chose to hold herself. Jay North. We end with one of the most poignant stories on this entire list, because Jay North lived out the full brutal arc of 1950s and early 1960s child stardom, from the very top of national fame to a long and painful struggle in its aftermath. And then, remarkably, he turned that pain into purpose, becoming a voice for the protection of other child performers so that they might be spared what he went through. His life gathers up so many of the themes running through all these stories that he makes a fitting final portrait. Jay was born in the year 1951. He shot to enormous fame as a small boy playing the mischievous, cowlick title character on a hugely popular television comedy about a well-meaning little troublemaker who drives his neighbor to distraction. For a few years, Jay North was one of the most famous children in America. His face was everywhere. The character he played became a household name. He was the very picture of the adorable, rascally all-American boy, adored by millions of viewers who tuned in every week to watch his gentle mischief. But behind that cheerful image, Jay's experience of childhood fame was, by his own later accounts, deeply painful. The reality of being a working child star, of carrying an entire show on his small shoulders while being managed by adults, was far harder than the sunny character suggested. He has spoken about the harsh treatment and the emotional difficulty he endured during those years, a childhood dominated by work and pressure, rather than by the freedom and play that the character seemed to embody. Once again, the gap between the happy child on the screen and the real child behind it was wide and sorrowful. Then came the fall, and it was severe. When the show ended, Jay was hit hard by typecasting. He was so completely identified with that one famous little boy that the industry struggled to see him as anything else, and the roles that might have carried him forward did not come. He drifted through the difficult years that follow child stardom, doing some voice work in animation, but never recapturing the prominence of his early fame. Like so many on this list, he found the transition out of childhood stardom brutally hard, and he carried the wounds of his early experience with him for a long time. Eventually, Jay North left the entertainment world in a much more complete way, taking on ordinary work far from any studio, including a job in the world of corrections. The famous television boy became, for a time, an ordinary working man far outside the spotlight, living the kind of quiet post-fame existence that swallowed so many of his peers. His story could easily have ended there, as another cautionary tale of a child used up and discarded by the machine. But Jay North did something meaningful with his pain. He became an advocate, lending his voice and his hard-earned experience to the cause of protecting child actors, working alongside others who had lived through the same difficulties to push for better treatment of the children who work in entertainment. He turned his own suffering into a mission to spare others, using the story of his own lost childhood as a warning and a call for change. That transformation, from victim of the system to advocate against its cruelties, gives his story a real and hard-won dignity. Jay North's life brings this whole list full circle. He was adored as a child and then discarded and left to struggle, exactly the pattern that runs through so many of these stories. But he refused to let that be the end of it. He survived, he made peace with his past, and he tried to make things better for the children who would come after him. In doing so, he became not just another disappeared child star, but a voice speaking up for all of them. And so he is the right note to end on, because his story holds both halves of everything we have seen. There is the terrible cost that childhood fame extracted from so many of these young people. And there is the possibility, at least for some, of turning that cost into something meaningful. Jay